The diesel fumes were burning Hans Weber's lungs. At just 19, crouched in the engine room of U-505, the air tasted like metal, oil, and fear. The explosion had thrown him against the starboard diesel, leaving his hands slick with hydraulic fluid. The deck tilted at an impossible angle. Water seeped in. Weber, once a farm boy from outside Hamburg, had trained in Kiel 16 months earlier to maintain the twin diesels that drove the U-boat through the Atlantic. Now those engines were dying. Depth charges struck at 11:09 a.m. on June 4, 1944. USS Chatelain had fired Hedgehog mortars, explosives that detonated on contact. The blast jammed the rudder and flooded the aft compartments. Weber felt the submarine lurch upward. They were surfacing. Above him, someone screamed for the crew to get topside. Weber scrambled up the ladder, metal rungs slippery under his palms. The smell shifted from diesel and sweat to salt air and cordite as he climbed toward daylight. When he emerged through the conning tower, sunlight hit him like a fist. 5 American warships circled U-505. Machine gun fire raked the deck. He saw Gottfried Fischer, the radio man, crumple as shells punched holes into the conning tower. Metal fragments sprayed across the deck. Oberleutnant zur See Harald Lange stood pale at the conning tower, 35, thin and solemn. He had taken command only months earlier after the previous captain shot himself during a depth charge attack. Lange's voice cut through the chaos. "Abandon ship," Weber jumped. The Atlantic was colder than he imagined. It hit him like needles. He gasped as water filled his mouth, salt and diesel burning his throat. His uniform dragged him downward. Around him, 58 men thrashed in the waves the destroyers circled. Weber heard their engines, a deep rumble through his chest. He braced for machine gun fire, what he had been told Americans did. Instead, a life preserver splashed beside him. An American voice shouted from USS Chatelain, "Hold on, we're coming." Weber didn't understand the words, only the tone. Nearby, Wolfgang Schiller, wounded and weak, watched an American sailor dive into the water, not to attack, but to rescue. The sailor swam to Hans Gobler, a torpedo mechanic floating face down. He flipped him over and held his head above water while ropes were thrown from the destroyer. Other sailors joined, diving in to save struggling, wounded German submariners. A rope landed near Schiller. He grabbed it. American hands hauled him aboard USS Jenks. He collapsed on the deck, shivering. A young sailor with red hair crouched beside him, offering something unexpected, an orange. "Here," the sailor said, then tried German. "Gut, Essen. Good." The fruit felt unreal after months of canned rations. Another American wrapped him in a wool blanket. Nearby, a radio man shivered uncontrollably until medics reached him. Weber was pulled aboard Chatelain. His fingers were numb. Someone placed an orange in his hand. An American officer, older, calm, checked each German, miming questions about injuries. He called for a medic when he saw Weber's bleeding hands. "You're safe now." The gesture, a hand on Weber's shoulder, made it unmistakable. Meanwhile, Captain Lang was the last rescued, his legs wounded. Carried gently by American sailors, he was taken below decks to the medical bay. The ship's surgeon worked quickly. Irrigation, debridement, sulfur powder, stitches, bandages, morphine. His tone was reassuring, no hostility, just care. 58 of 59 men from U-505 were alive, rescued by the enemy they feared. But another drama unfolded. The U.S. Navy wanted the U-505 itself. Capturing an intact German U-boat was considered impossible, yet U-505 remained afloat. American sailors from the carrier group launched a daring boarding action. They scrambled onto the still-moving submarine. Water spilled across the deck. The boarding team hauled themselves into the conning tower, pistols ready. They expected explosives or booby traps. Instead, they found the interior flooded but intact. Inside, they raced down the ladder. The control room hissed with leaking pipes. The floor was slick with oil. The Germans had set scuttling charges but failed to activate them. The Americans searched for demolition timers. None were ticking. Machinery groaned. The submarine was slowly sinking. The boarding team fanned out. They entered the radio room where a priceless treasure awaited. The Enigma machine still bolted to the table. Its rotors were still warm from use. Beside it lay code books, weather keys, and operation schedules. Intelligence gold. The Americans tore them free, stuffing them into waterproof bags. They grabbed logbooks, charts, and torpedo firing manuals before water closed in. But they needed to save the submarine too. In the engine room, control rods were jammed. Water rushed through torn bulkheads. They struggled to shut valves while ankle-deep in freezing water. One slipped, smashing his knee on a valve wheel. By 11:21 a.m., the boarding team raised a makeshift American flag above the conning tower. U-505 was now the first enemy vessel captured afloat by the U.S. Navy since the War of 1812. The flotilla erupted in cheers. They began towing the crippled submarine. Pumps were lowered from escort ships to keep it from flooding. It was a delicate operation. If a cable snapped, the submarine would vanish beneath the surface with all its secrets. Hours passed, the sea calmed. The boarding team remained inside, cramped in the dying submarine, checking for rising water. They worked by red emergency lamps. The air was thick with diesel fumes leaking from ruptured lines. On USS Guadalcanal, Captain Daniel Gallery watched the operation through binoculars. A pioneer of anti-submarine warfare, he had planned this capture for months. He believed that taking a U-boat alive could shorten the war. Gallery knew the risks. If Germany learned about the capture, they would change their codes. Secrecy was essential. The Americans radioed Washington, but used coded phrasing suggesting only that materials had been recovered at sea. The Germans rescued from the water had no idea their submarine had been captured. They believed it had sunk. American officers kept the truth from them deliberately, isolating them to preserve the secret. Below decks, U.S. Navy medics tended to the injured Germans. Morphine doses were carefully recorded. The Americans treated them with a professionalism that surprised the prisoners. Some expected brutality. Instead, they received oranges. As night fell, the captured Germans were given blankets and coffee. Many had hypothermia. A few had broken bones. Shivering, Weber stared at the steel floor of the mess deck, stunned. Hours ago, he was sure he would die. On the horizon, the silhouette of U-505 remained visible. It trailed behind the tow ship, half submerged but afloat. The impossible had happened. A German U-boat captured intact, filled with the secrets of the Atlantic War. The prisoners were moved under guard, but not harshly. They were escorted to makeshift quarters below deck. Weber glanced at the sailors watching them. Young men like himself, tired, soaked, but not hostile. War felt strangely distant in that moment. Captain Lang, bandaged and pale, sat propped against a bulkhead. He watched his crew in silence, taking quiet note of who was injured, who needed help, who was missing. His face showed pain, but also relief. His men were alive. An American officer approached Lange. "Doctor will check on you soon," he said slowly, choosing simple English. Lang nodded, responding in German. Neither understood the other, but tone alone carried meaning. Nearby, a young American sailor tried offering a blanket to a shivering German. When the German hesitated, the sailor gently draped it over his shoulders. Moments like these made Weber's stomach twist with confusion. He had been told Americans were merciless, but everything around him contradicted that. The slaughter he feared never came. Instead, he watched crews bring hot soup, water, and medical kits, moving briskly from man to man. Some Germans whispered among themselves, wondering if this kindness was a trick. Others avoided eye contact altogether, ashamed to have survived when friends had not. Fear of the unknown weighed heavily on every prisoner. The night deepened, engines hummed softly beneath their feet. The Americans dimmed the lights in the compartment to let the prisoners sleep. Weber couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of explosions in the freezing water. Above deck, the boarding team continued its work inside U-505. They retrieved spare Enigma rotors, signal flares, code sheets hidden behind electrical panels, and navigational logs tucked inside waterproof bins. In the forward torpedo room, water still sloshed knee-high. They waded through it, gripping handrails, searching for any remaining explosives or hazards. The air smelled of rust, seawater, and spent fuel. The submarine groaned under stress, metal flexing as waves hit its hull. The team leader signaled for caution. The vessel could still sink if they misjudged the structural damage. Every movement had to be deliberate. On the towing ships, engineers monitored the massive strain on the cables. Steel groaned. Any sudden swell could snap the lines like thread. They worked in shifts, adjusting tension as the seas changed through the night. Meanwhile, intelligence officers hovered anxiously over the recovered materials. They inventoried each document, marking pages with grease pencils. They knew these papers would end up in Washington and London within days. The Enigma machine was wrapped securely and guarded constantly. Even on the open ocean, sailors stood watch over it, wary of water, mishandling, or even curious hands. It was now one of the most valuable objects in the Atlantic, By dawn, the sky turned gray-blue. The U.S. task force gathered in formation, towing their unlikely prize westward. The ocean was calm for the first time in days, as if holding its breath after the violence. Weber woke with a start, disoriented. For a moment, he expected to be back in U-505's cramped engine room. Instead, he was lying on an American cot, wrapped in a blanket, the thrum of American engines under him. He felt alive and conflicted. Around him, other Germans were stirring. Some muttered in pain. Others simply stared at the ceiling in silence. The Americans had left water canteens nearby. A medic walked in periodically, checking pulses, changing bandages, offering aspirin. Weber's hands throbbed from the cuts he'd received in the engine room. The American medic, Roberts according to his name tag, cleaned the wounds with practiced care. Weber winced as antiseptic burned through the grease lodged in his skin. Roberts apologized reflexively, even though Weber didn't understand the words. But the tone was unmistakably gentle. He wrapped the hands in clean gauze and gave Weber a reassuring nod. Weber nodded back, confused but grateful. In another compartment, Captain Lang sat upright despite orders to rest. His injuries were severe, but he refused to show weakness. The Americans respected his composure. One officer quietly remarked, "Tough man." Lang noticed everything. Where guards stood, how they moved, how often the lights dimmed. He was still an officer, even in captivity. But he also noted the care shown to his men. It softened something in him, though he fought to hide it. Crewmen whispered that perhaps the Americans were following some propaganda agenda. Others said no. This was just how they treated prisoners. Weber had no answer. All he knew was that he wasn't dead, and that fact felt strange. On deck, sailors scrubbed blood and oil from the planks. The air carried the scent of salt and gasoline. The Atlantic was calm again, the morning sun glinting off waves as destroyers maintained their protective ring around Guadalcanal. The captured U-boat cut a dark silhouette against the water, still under tow, still precarious. Pump crews continued lowering hoses into its hull, fighting the flood inch by inch. One mistake and the ocean would claim it forever. Inside U-505, the boarding team kept searching for hidden compartments. German submarines often concealed code sheets in steel tubes or under false panels. Every find could shift Allied strategy. Every missed item could cost lives. They found spare torpedoes still secured in racks. One had been partially armed but never loaded. The team disarmed it with extreme caution, beads of sweat forming despite the cold. A single jolt could have been catastrophic. In the control room, the Americans marveled at the complex instrumentation. Depth gauges, trim wheels, red-lit panels, everything built for survival under crushing pressure. It was like stepping inside the beating heart of the German Navy. A sailor brushed dust from the periscope eyepiece and couldn't resist looking through it. The horizon snapped into focus, bright and sharp. For a moment, he imagined what it felt like to stalk ships through that lens. They gathered personal items too. Letters, photographs, harmonicas, ration tins, small pieces of lives lived in steel corridors. These would later be cataloged and eventually returned, but for now they were evidence in the war. As the sun rose higher, American officers met on the bridge. Their conversation was terse. The operation was unprecedented. They needed to plan for secrecy, transport, interrogation protocols, and how to explain the event without revealing the truth. One decision was clear. The Germans aboard must continue believing their submarine was lost at sea. If word of the capture leaked, years of code breaking could be undone. The secret of U-505 had to be buried, at least for now.